How do you feel about Ukraine striking military targets inside of Russia? Fair game or crossing the line? Either way, Ukraine's in a tough spot here. It's almost like we've created this weird rule where Russia can dictate where the war will be fought and everywhere else is out of bounds. That's not reality, or at least that's not a reality that Ukraine can operate within if they want to win. For Russia, keeping the entirety of this war inside of Ukraine is a huge victory. I mean, as of now, the two militaries are tearing each other apart at the front, as you'd expect in any war. But when we look at civilian populations, governmental institutions, and industry, the death and destruction is entirely one-sided. It's the Ukrainian people that are having their cities razed, their apartment buildings hit with missiles, and living with the constant anxiety of air raid sirens. And it's the Ukrainian government and industry that can't operate as intended because they're under attack. That playing field entirely favors Russia. On the other hand, the Russian government is able to conduct business as usual. Their civilians are able to observe the war from the safety of their own home, and their defense industry is physically untouched. Yes, sanctions are in place and on the verge of getting more severe, but I'm sure most people would rather try to navigate sanctions than dodge missile attacks. In nearly every sense, the impact of this war is being felt more in Ukraine than in Russia. That's not the path to victory. I mean, even if Ukraine is able to achieve moderate gains on the battlefield during the expected spring or summer offensive, they're still under the gun. The balance of pressure there has to shift. This isn't a call for terrorist-style attacks against Russian civilians. I don't think that would help Ukraine at all, and personally, even in the midst of an all-out war, I don't believe that's the morally correct path to take. But there are a lot of military and industrial targets all across Russia that could be considered prime targets. The challenge Ukraine faces here is twofold. First is the lack of munitions to conduct that style of strike, and the second are US and NATO concerns about escalation. We have seen a few long-range attacks carried out by Ukraine, notably the attacks on Engels and Kursk air bases in December, which are believed to have been carried out with Tupolev Tu-141 drones. Look, barely 150 of these were produced in the Soviet Union between 1979 and 1989, and it's really not known how many Ukraine currently has in their arsenal. At baseline, I wouldn't have expected Ukraine to have more than 50 of the 150 total produced, and that's probably on the high side. So how many are still operational 30 plus years after they were built? I mean, take your best guess, but bottom line, the Tu-141 likely is not a good bet for sustained aerial operations against Russia. The quantity just isn't going to be there, and with limited stocks, slinging those against Russian air defense networks is a pretty risky way to utilize that asset. We tend to see more footage of when Russian air defenses fail because that's when there's a big boom, but in reality, they do have a substantial air defense capability. Look, Russia never expected to win an air war with NATO, and in turn, they spent a lot of their money on air defense systems. I had a great chat a little while back with some active duty Patriot operators. You can check it out here. They got into the nuts and bolts of the Patriot versus the S-400, but that's not really what's at play here. It's simply volume of coverage. Sure, maybe a few sneak through, but Russia's a relatively hardened target against airborne threats, and one or two successful strikes over a few months isn't going to change much. That leads us into the debate around ATACMS, or the Army Tactical Missile System, which is a big old missile fired from the HIMARS or the MLRS with an unclassified range of 300 kilometers, which is a long ways, but for reference, still leaves Moscow out of the range of anything fired inside of Ukraine. So it's not like this one weapon system can range all of Russia. It's just a bit further than what Ukraine currently possesses. And one of the major arguments against providing ATACMS to Ukraine is this concern that they would use them to strike inside of Russia, which could lead to a broader escalation of the war. This concern has even been hinted at by Russia, where recent reports have said that their red line, to overuse a term that's a little bit worn down by now, is if Russian strategic assets were struck by NATO-provided weapons. And China hinted that that move could be enough for them to get overtly involved, likely in terms of shipping military aid, not necessarily like actual Chinese troops on the ground. An escalation in that sense isn't just bad for the US, it could be catastrophic for Ukraine. The last thing they need right now is China opening up their warehouses and manufacturing facilities to the Russian military. So the Ukrainian organic supply probably isn't there, and NATO weapons, even if provided, are going to be too risky to use inside of Russia. That leaves good old-fashioned sabotage. I got it. Easier said than done, but it's likely easier here than most major conflicts in recent history. By that I mean there's enough similarity in language, history, and culture between the two nations for Ukrainian supporters to successfully hide and operate inside of Russia. And I believe there will come a point in this war where we're going to start to see more fires and explosions in factories, barracks, rail hubs, and governmental buildings all inside of Russia. We've already seen it a little bit with the assassinations of Daria Dugina and Vladimir Tatarsky. In both cases, the United States and NATO were a little on edge. You can tell they weren't very happy about the prospect that the Ukrainian government could be behind either one of those. But I think that's our projecting onto Ukraine our own failed policy from previous conflicts. We're imposing a restraint on Ukraine that did not work out well for us. Look back at World War II. Imagine a scenario where the Allies were putting together the force to liberate Europe, and orders come down that they couldn't touch anything inside of Germany. Not only did they have to stop advancing at the German borders, but airstrikes inside of Germany wouldn't be permitted. Laughable, right? They're trying to win a war with millions of lives in the balance, and they're going to add a self-imposed restriction that makes the overall operation less likely to succeed? That was total war. It wasn't pretty. The Allied bombings in Germany killed a lot of people, including innocent women and children, but all of that together was needed to topple the Nazi war machine and bring about an absolute end to the war. Again, if the Allies were to press forward to the German borders and then stop, nobody would actually believe the war was over, right? A pause at best. Germany would just regroup and try again. Well, we don't have to dream up a scenario in World War II because unfortunately we do have experience with that sort of self-imposed restriction here in the United States. From Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, that's exactly what we did. To be fair, war does not occur in a vacuum, and Clausewitz famously said that, quote, war is a mere continuation of policy by other means, end quote. So while I'm going to bring up a few cases here where the U.S. attempted to fight a restricted war, there are very valid arguments that those restrictions actually help the overall cause. Essentially, I'm going to make a very simple case about a very complex topic, so bear with me. In Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were pretty quick to learn that the U.S. wasn't very keen on pushing into Laos and Cambodia. Yes, it did happen, but those were the exception when viewed against the size and scope of operations carried out in South Vietnam. So our adversaries were smart. They moved some of their main bases out of the area that we had decided was the war zone, in this case South Vietnam, into countries where we were much less likely to enter in force. For years, NVA and VC elements moved along the Ho Chi Minh Trail network, bringing supplies and reinforcements into the South along a route largely uncontested by U.S. forces. The U.S. knew they were there and would, on occasion, send out small teams to identify and direct airstrikes, but overall, that supply corridor remained open for the duration of the war. The U.S. fought by their own set of rules, and the enemy fought by theirs. And at the end of the day, did not work out very well for the United States and the people of South Vietnam. Fast forward to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, the U.S. knew pretty early on that foreign fighters were funneling through Syria into the western part of the country, especially those looking to join al-Qaeda in Iraq. They'd cross in the west, follow the Euphrates River Valley, and eventually link up with others in places like Ramadi, Fallujah, and Baghdad. There were a lot of operations put in place to try to stem that flow, but we never pushed into Syria to nip that in the bud. Same went for Iran in the east. The United States knew that Iran was sending in powerful EFP IEDs that were destroying American armor and killing American service members. They also knew that the Iranian Quds Force was training and arming Shiite militias that would turn around and attack U.S. and coalition forces. But again, we conducted no serious military action against the source inside of Iran. Moving over to Afghanistan, it was almost a joke between all of us that the Taliban would set up shop in Pakistan, cross into Afghanistan to carry out attacks, and then move back across where they knew we couldn't get them. It's a little more of a gray area here since the tribal areas in western Pakistan have been on the receiving end of countless U.S. drone strikes for nearly 20 years, but we knew where they were going. We knew where they were, and we had to stop at this random line in the mountains where they knew they had a safe haven. It makes me wonder how these conflicts would have played out if the U.S. had gone full bore and really taken the fight to the enemy wherever they were. I mean, it's, of course, no guarantee that they would have turned out necessarily any better, but we certainly added some challenging rules for ourselves while we were there. Luckily for the United States, the wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan were not about our national survival. For Ukraine, however, that's exactly what is at stake. Now, a valid concern here is that any strike inside of Russia could lead to escalation. And while on the one hand, Russia has kind of shifted their red lines all over the place, we can't assume those red lines don't exist at all. Just because Russia hasn't used a nuclear weapon to date doesn't mean they never will. Right? And it's careless to completely ignore the potential risks here. But think of how a situation could play out here. I mean, if it's a NATO-provided weapon, NATO gives the targeting data, and a strike is carried out, say, in Moscow, yeah, I can see how Russia could very well be considering a retaliatory strike against one or more NATO members. We'd probably do the same if we were in their shoes. But Ukrainian-sourced sabotage, like we saw against the Kerch Bridge, that's just a continuation of the current war. I mean, Russia very well may respond against Ukrainian targets, but how is that any different than the random drone or missile strikes Ukraine has suffered for the past year? At the end of the day, Russia doesn't want a war with NATO, and NATO doesn't want a war with Russia. So I don't see a clear Ukrainian-sourced attack inside of Russia serving as an excuse to escalate the war beyond these two countries. Maybe I'm wrong. It's a risky move, but Ukraine can't afford to create and abide by these imaginary rules of war that, as they're set today, only favor Russia. There are actual laws of armed conflict that should be adhered to. Don't target civilians or medical personnel, proper treatment of prisoners of war, don't use banned weapons, and quite a bit more. But there's nothing that says that a war has to be fought on the territory dictated by the invading force. Ukraine is in a total war for the survival of their nation, and trying to operate how the United States did in recent conflicts is a recipe for failure. It's a tough spot for Ukraine. They're going to have to walk a fine line between appeasing their supporters in the West and finding ways to make impactful strikes inside of Russia. And I think they're going to. And if Ukraine emerges victorious in this war, I think there's going to be a lot of talk about how attacks inside of Russia helped bring it to a close.